If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Frank Peterson, and this happened to me in the winter of 1965, up in the boundary waters of Minnesota. I was 52 then, working as a winter rescue specialist. You know, the person they call when someone gets lost in the snow or trapped in a storm. I'd been doing this job for nearly 30 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the cold could do to a person. I was wrong. I should probably mention that I used to be somebody kind of important, an Olympic biathlete. That means I was pretty good at cross-country skiing and shooting rifles. Won a couple of medals back in the day. But that feels like another lifetime now. These days, those skills mostly help me reach people who need saving from the cold. The cold, it's funny how it's been such a big part of my life. Sometimes I think it's been following me, like it has some kind of plan. It took my wife Sarah from me 12 years ago during a rescue that went wrong. She froze to death while I was trying to save someone else. The worst part, I was supposed to be an expert at preventing exactly that kind of thing. But this story isn't about my past. It's about something that happened during the strangest winter I've ever seen. A winter when the northern lights danced in the sky at the wrong times. When animals ran away from something we couldn't see. And when people started turning up frozen solid in places they shouldn't have been. I never used to believe in the old stories the local tribes told about winter spirits and ancient creatures that feed on warmth instead of flesh. But after what I saw that winter, well, let me tell you what happened, and you can decide for yourself what to believe. It started on a Tuesday night in November. The temperature had dropped to 40 below zero, which was strange because it wasn't even deep winter yet. I was sitting in my office at the ranger station, drinking coffee and doing paperwork, when the call came in. Frank, you need to come see this. Tom Wheeler, my friend and fellow ranger, said through the radio. His voice sounded shaky. Tom wasn't the type to get scared easily. He'd been working these woods almost as long as I had. What V you got? I asked, already reaching for my coat. Body found up near Eagle Ridge, but it's not like anything we've seen before. 20 minutes later, I was parking my truck at the trailhead. The moment I stepped out, I knew something was wrong. The air felt different, heavier somehow, and colder than it should be. Even for 40 below, my breath made thick clouds in my flashlight beam. Tom was waiting for me, stamping his feet to stay warm. His usual smile was gone. It's this way, he said, pointing up the trail. About 10 minutes walk. As we hiked, I noticed how quiet it was. Minnesota winters are usually silent, but this was different. No owl calls, no rustle of night animals, nothing, just our boots crunching in the snow and our breathing. The northern lights flickered overhead, painting the snow in weird green and purple colors. They'd been acting strange lately, showing up at odd times and moving in ways I'd never seen before, like tonight. They were swirling in tight circles instead of their usual waves, almost like they were pointing at something. We found the body right where Tom said it would be, and I felt my stomach turn. Martin Erickson, one of our local ice fishermen, was frozen solid 15 feet up in the air. His body was stuck to nothing, just suspended there in a perfect casing of ice. Like someone had poured water around him and frozen it in midair. But there was no water source nearby. No way this could have happened naturally. I moved closer, shining my light on Martin's face. I wish I hadn't. His eyes were wide open, his mouth frozen in a scream. But it was the ice crystals that really got to me. They weren't forming on him like normal frost. They were spreading outward from inside his body, as if he'd frozen from the inside out. Look at this, Tom called from behind a big pine tree. His flashlight showed another strange sight, ice crawling up the tree trunk in a spiral pattern, like frozen lightning. I touched it with my gloved hand and felt odd grooves underneath, like something had carved into the wood before the ice formed. That's when we heard it, a sound like breaking glass, but deeper, coming from somewhere in the dark woods. The northern lights pulsed brighter for a second, and in that flash of green light, I saw something move between the trees. Something big. The temperature dropped so fast my nose hurt. Back to the trucks, I ordered, my old military voice coming back. Now, as we turned to leave, I caught sight of tracks in the snow. They were huge, twice the size of a bear print, with strange geometric patterns inside them. As I watched, frost started creeping across the tracks, like the cold itself was following whatever had made them. That was the beginning. I didn't know it then, but those tracks would lead us to something that had been hunting in these woods for a very, very long time. The next few days were a blur of more frozen bodies and stranger discoveries. We found Bill Chun, the local mailman, frozen solid inside his truck. The weird part, all the windows were rolled up, the doors were locked, and the ice was spreading from the middle of his chest. Just like with Martin, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sarah's face, remembered how she looked when I found her that day, frozen in the snow. These new deaths felt different, though. When Sarah died, it was because nature is harsh and unforgiving, but these felt planned. I started digging through old records in the ranger station's basement. That's when I found something that made my blood run cold. Every 50 years, like clockwork, there would be a winter where people went missing, where the temperatures dropped to impossible lows, where the northern lights danced at the wrong times. Frank, you need to see this. Tom called me on the radio one morning. His voice was shaking again. I drove out to meet him at Old Bear Lake, and what I saw there still haunts me. The entire lake was frozen solid, which wasn't unusual for Minnesota. What was unusual were the shapes in the ice. Huge, perfect circles, hundreds of them, each one smaller than the last, making a spiral pattern that led to the center of the lake. And in the middle of it all was another frozen body. As we walked closer to the center, following the spiral pattern, the ice under our feet was different. Normal ice is kind of cloudy, but this was crystal clear, like glass, and deep under it, we could see more shapes moving. At first, I thought they were fish, but fish don't make geometric patterns. Fish don't leave frost trails behind them. That's when we heard it again, that deep. Glass breaking sound from the first night, but this time, it was closer, much closer. The northern lights suddenly lit up the whole sky, bright as day. And what we saw standing at the edge of the lake made us both freeze in our tracks. It was tall, maybe 15 feet high, and looked like it was made of living ice. Its body was full of those same geometric patterns we'd seen in the tracks. Steam rose off as it moved, like it was so cold it was freezing the air itself. And its eyes were the same swirling colors as the northern lights. "Don't move," I whispered to Tom. The thing hadn't seen us yet. It was focused on something in the woods behind us. We watched as it raised one long, crystalline arm, and a beam of pure cold shot from its hand into the trees. There was a crashing sound, and then silence. When we checked later, we found a moose frozen solid, ice crystals spreading from its heart outward, just like the others. I knew then that we weren't dealing with just bad weather or a natural phenomenon. Something ancient had woken up in our woods, something that hunted with the cold itself. And somehow, I had to find a way to stop it before it froze everything and everyone I'd sworn to protect. Back at the ranger station, I gathered everyone I could trust: Tom, Linda Martinez from Search and Rescue, and Mike Littlewolf, who knew all the old stories his grandfather had told him about these woods. We spread out maps on my desk and started planning. My grandfather used to talk about the ice walker. Mike said quietly, pointing to the areas where we'd found the bodies, he said it wakes up when the lights dance wrong in the sky, and it feeds on the warmth of living things. But how do we fight something made of ice? Linda asked, rubbing her arms like she was cold. Even though we were inside, that's when I remembered something from my old Olympic training days. Heat. I said, everything has a weakness. Ice's weakness is heat. We spent the next day gathering everything we could think of that made heat. Road flares, emergency heating packs, even some thermal explosives that the mining company used for breaking up frozen ground. Tom knew a guy who worked there and didn't ask too many questions. That night, the temperature dropped to 50 below zero. The radio was full of panic, roads freezing solid, pipes bursting all over town, people's car engines freezing even with block heaters. The thing was getting stronger, making the whole region colder. We got our chance sooner than we expected. One of our trail cameras caught it moving toward Peterson Lake, where ice fishermen usually gathered. We had to stop it before it reached them. 4 of us went out: me, Tom, Linda, and Mike. We each carried a backpack full of road flares and thermal explosives. My old biathlon rifle was strapped to my back, though I wasn't sure bullets would do much good against living ice. The northern lights were brighter than I'd ever seen them, turning the snow weird colors and making it hard to see clearly. The cold was so intense it hurt to breathe. Every breath made a crackling sound, like tiny icicles forming in our lungs. We found its trail easily. Everything was frozen solid around its footprints. But something was wrong. The track split off in different directions. It's making copies of itself. Mike whispered, pointing at ice formations that were slowly taking human-like shapes. The story said it could do that. Before we could react, one of the ice copies burst up from the snow right in front of us. Linda screamed as its freezing hand grabbed her arm. I watched in horror as ice crystals started spreading up from where it touched her. I didn't think, I just acted. I grabbed a road flare from my pocket, lit it, and jammed it into the ice creature's chest. It made that glass-breaking sound we'd heard before, but higher pitched, almost like a scream. The ice copy shattered, and Linda fell back, shaking but alive. The ice on her arm cracked and fell away. Fireworks, I shouted, but watch out, there are more of them. That's when we heard the real one coming. The ground shook with each step, and the air got so cold I could feel my eyes starting to freeze through the swirling lights and snow. I saw it emerge from the woods. It was even bigger up close, and now I could see what looked like frozen bodies suspended inside its ice body. Like flies trapped in amber, it raised its arms, and the northern lights seemed to bend toward it, like it was drawing power from them. I knew right then that this was going to be the fight of my life, and if we lost, the cold would keep spreading until everything was frozen solid. I thought of Sarah, of all the people I'd failed to save, and gripped my flare gun tighter. Spread out, I ordered. Remember the plan. We've got one shot at this. The ice walker looked right at me with those swirling aurora eyes, and I swear it remembered me from that night at the lake. It knew I was the one it had to kill first. Everything happened fast after that. The creature shot beams of pure cold from its hands, turning trees into instant ice sculptures. We scattered, just like we'd planned. Tom ran left, Linda right, while Mike circled behind it with his backpack full of road flares. Now, I shouted, and we all threw our first round of flares. They arced through the air, glowing red against the green sky. Where they hit the creature, its ice body sizzled and cracked. It made that horrible glass-breaking scream again, but it didn't fall. Instead, it got angry with a wave of its arm. It created more ice copies of itself, 5, 10, 15 of them, all moving towards us. The cold was so bad now that my eyelashes were freezing together. I could barely move my fingers to grab more flares. Frank! Tom's scream made me turn. 2 ice copies had him cornered against a tree. I raised my old biathlon rifle, thanking God for all those years of practice. 2 shots. Perfect hits. Right where the flares had already weakened them. They shattered like broken windows. But saving Tom cost me precious seconds. I felt something cold grab my leg and looked down to see an ice copy rising from the snow. Its frozen hand around my ankle. Cold shot up my leg like 1,000 needles. I remembered Sarah describing this feeling. Right before, no, not this time. I wouldn't let the cold win again. I smashed a heating pack against the ice copy's face, and its head melted enough for me to break free. But the real ice walker was coming for me now, and the northern lights were swirling around it like a tornado of color. The thermal explosives. Linda screamed from somewhere to my right. Use them now! My leg was half frozen, and I could barely walk. But I managed to pull the trigger on the flare gun, shooting a bright red signal into the sky. That was the sign we'd planned. Mike, who'd made it behind the creature, threw his whole backpack of thermal explosives at its feet. The ice walker turned, raising its arms to freeze Mike solid. But that's exactly what we wanted it to do, because it wasn't looking at me anymore. My fingers were so cold they almost didn't work. But I grabbed our last 3 thermal explosives and used my old Olympic throwing skills one last time. They flew straight and true, right into the cracks the flares had made in the creature's chest. The explosion was like 100 suns going off at once. The ice walker's scream shattered every piece of ice for 100 feet in every direction. I saw its body starting to break apart, pieces of it flying everywhere. The frozen bodies trapped inside it fell to the ground like fallen icicles. Get down! I yelled, throwing myself over Mike as ice shards flew everywhere. I felt something sharp and cold pierce my shoulder. And then everything went white. I woke up 3 days later in the hospital. They told me I almost died from the cold, and that my shoulder would never work quite right again. But we'd won. The ice walker was gone, shattered into a million pieces. The temperature was already rising back to normal winter levels. But sometimes, on very cold nights when the northern lights dance strange patterns in the sky, I think about those geometric tracks we found in the snow. They never did find all the pieces of the ice walker, and the winters up here, they're still colder than they used to be. Mike says his grandfather told him these creatures can never really die. They just sleep for 50 years at a time. I'll be too old to fight when it wakes up again. If it does. But I've written down everything we learned about how to fight it. And I'm making sure the next generation of rangers knows what to look for. Because up here in the Boundary Waters, winter isn't just a season. Sometimes it's alive, and sometimes it hunts. My name is Michael O'Brien, and this happened to me back in 1991. When I was working as a cave rescue specialist at Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky. I never told anyone the full story before, partly because no one would believe me, and partly because I still wake up screaming when I think about it too much. But I need to write it down now. While I still can, maybe then someone will understand why I am the way I am. I was 39 then, And I'd been doing cave rescues for nearly 15 years. People called me one of the best in the business, but they didn't know about the nightmares. They didn't know how my hands would shake every time I had to squeeze through a tight tunnel, or how I'd break out in cold sweats when the walls felt too close. Only my team knew about my claustrophobia, and they kept my secret because I was still good at my job. I had to be. I owed it to Tommy. Tommy was my little brother. He died in a cave collapse when I was 24 and he was 20. We were exploring a new passage we'd found, just the two of us. When the ceiling came down, I made it out. He didn't. They never even found his body, just his broken helmet and one bloody boot. After that, something broke inside me, but I couldn't quit. Instead, I threw myself into rescue work, determined to save others where I couldn't save him. That spring was the wettest anyone could remember. The rain came down for weeks, turning the Kentucky hills into a maze of mud and swollen streams. Underground, the cave systems were changing. New passages opened up as the water carved through limestone that had stood unchanged for millions of years. The old-timers in the area started telling stories about Native American warnings, about hollow places that should stay sealed, about things that lived in the deep dark that were better left alone. I didn't pay much attention to those stories. Not then. I was too busy getting ready for the tourist season and checking my special rescue gear. I'd modified a lot of my equipment over the years. Reinforced cables that could hold twice the normal weight. Extra bright lights that could run for days. An emergency breathing apparatus I'd designed myself. I never went into a cave without being prepared for anything. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened when they found that new passage in the deepest part of the cave system. Nothing could have prepared any of us for what was waiting down there in the dark. It started with a simple missing persons report. 6 tourists and their guide had gone in for a standard tour of the newly opened section. They never came out. That's when they called me. I remember sitting in the rescue station when the phone rang. It was around midnight, and the rain was beating against the windows like someone throwing handfuls of pebbles. Sarah Chun, my second in command, answered it. I knew it was bad news just from how her face changed. 7 people, she said after hanging up. They were supposed to be back 6 hours ago. I felt that familiar knot in my stomach. Asterisk 6 hours late. In the new section. With all this rain, asterisk, I called in my best team, Sarah, who knew everything about cave geology. Mike Torres, our medical expert, and John Kelly, who could squeeze through spaces that seemed impossibly small. Within an hour, we were at the cave entrance, double-checking our gear in the glow of emergency floodlights. The water levels are higher than usual. Sarah said, studying her charts, we should be careful about the lower passages. I nodded, trying to ignore the way my heart was already beating faster. The cave mouth looked like a huge black smile in the rainy darkness. Asterisk Tommy would have loved exploring this new section. Asterisk I thought, then pushed that idea away. I needed to stay focused. We went in at 1:15 a.m. The first hour was normal, just following the marked tourist path. Our headlamps making bright circles on the wet cave walls. The air felt different though. Usually, caves have their own smell, a mix of limestone and earth. But this time there was something else. Something that reminded me of rotten eggs. Anyone else smell that? Mike asked, saying what we were all thinking. The tourist path ended at a new opening that had appeared after the heavy rains. The Park Service had put up safety rails and lights. But the lights weren't working now. Our headlamps showed that the rails were still there, but something about them looked wrong. I moved closer, and my light caught something that made my blood run cold. The metal rails were partly melted, like someone had taken a blowtorch to them. On the ground nearby, we found a camera. When I picked it up, Pieces of it crumbled in my hands, as if it had been eaten away by strong acid. Michael, Sarah's voice shook a little. She was shining her light on the cave wall. There were deep grooves in the solid rock, like something with huge claws had carved through it like butter. That's when we heard it, a sound that didn't belong in any cave I'd ever been in. It was like whale song mixed with the screech of metal on metal, echoing from somewhere deep below us. And it was answered by another sound. Closer this time. John grabbed my arm. Please tell me that was just the wind. But we all knew there was no wind as deep in the cave. And we all knew that whatever made that sound was between us and the missing tourists. I took a deep breath and checked my rescue gear one more time. We keep going. I said, those people need us. But as we started down into the new passage, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. And somewhere in the back of my mind, those old Native American warnings about the hollow places didn't seem so foolish anymore. The new passage went down at a steep angle. We had to use our ropes. And every time the rope moved against the rock, it made a sound like someone whispering. The walls here were different, smoother, almost polished looking in places. Our light showed tiny crystals in the rock that sparkled like stars. Then John stopped suddenly. Did you hear that? Someone's crying. We all froze, listening, but I couldn't hear anything except water dripping somewhere in the darkness. There it is again. John turned his head quickly, shining his light down a side passage. It sounds like a little girl. John, there weren't any children in the missing group. Sarah said quietly. The youngest was 19, but John wasn't listening. His face had gone pale, and he was staring into the darkness like he could see something we couldn't. Then, without warning, he started walking toward the side passage. My sister's down there. He mumbled, she's scared. I grabbed his arm. John, you don't have a sister. You told me yourself you're an only child. He blinked hard, like he was waking up from a dream. What was I saying? I felt so sure I heard. He rubbed his eyes. My head feels weird. That's when I noticed the temperature had dropped. I could see my breath in the beam of my headlamp. The strange smell was stronger here, and the rock walls seemed to pulse slightly, like they were breathing. Asterisk no. Asterisk, I told myself. Asterisk, rocks don't breathe. You're imagining things. Asterisk, we found more signs of the missing group. A backpack that looked like it had been dipped in acid. A phone with deep claw marks through its screen. And then we saw the footprints in the muddy cave floor. But they were wrong. They started normally, then got deeper, like the people were being dragged down by something heavy. And beside them were other marks I didn't want to think about, long scratches from something with too many legs. Mike picked up a torn piece of clothing. There's no blood. He said, shouldn't there be blood? Before I could answer, we heard that horrible sound again, that whale song screech. It was closer now, and this time we could feel it in our bones. Sarah's light caught something moving in the darkness ahead. Just for a second, something that seemed to melt right through the solid rock wall. Did anyone else see that? Mike's voice was shaking. I nodded slowly. We need to stick together. Whatever's down here, it's trying to separate us, like it separated the tourist group. That's when Sarah pointed to something on her geology charts. Michael, this passage we're in, it's not on any of the maps. Not even the new ones they made last week. What do you mean? I mean, she swallowed hard. I mean, the cave is changing. Right now, while we're in it. And as if to prove her point, we heard a rumble behind us. When we turned around, the passage we'd come to was gone, replaced by solid rock like it had never existed at all. No, no, no. I pressed my hands against the rock wall where the passage had been. It was solid and cold, like it had been there for millions of years. My chest felt tight. Asterisk, don't panic. Asterisk, I told myself. Tommy wouldn't panic. There's only one way to go now. Sarah said softly, pointing her light down the tunnel ahead of us. As we walked, the passage got wider, opening into a huge cave room. Our lights couldn't reach the ceiling, but they showed us something that made us all stop dead in our tracks. The floor was covered in what looked like giant spider webs, but they were made of something that glowed slightly in the dark. And hanging in these webs were objects, bits of cameras, pieces of climbing gear, a park ranger's badge. They were all half melted, covered in the same acid that had eaten through the railings above. Look at the walls, Mike whispered. The walls were lined with holes, each one perfectly round, about the size of a car tire. They went up as far as our lights could reach. Something dark was dripping from them, sizzling when it hit the ground. That's when John screamed. He was pointing his light at something in the corner. It was the missing guide's jacket, still mostly intact, but inside it was nothing, just empty space where a person should have been, like something had gotten inside and eaten everything but the clothes. We're leaving, I said, right now. We'll get more help, better equipment, but before I could finish, that horrible screeching sound filled the air again. This time it wasn't just noise, I could feel it in my head, like fingers scratching at my brain. John fell to his knees, holding his ears. Sarah started crying. Then Mike shouted, "The holes! Something's coming out of the holes!" Our lights caught glimpses of movement long, wet limbs sliding out of the round holes in the walls. I counted 6, 8, too many limbs, moving in ways that limbs shouldn't move. The thing was pale white, like something that had never seen sunlight. Every time our lights hit it directly, it seemed to melt into the rock, only to appear somewhere else. "Run!" I yelled, but Mike was frozen in place, staring up at something above us. The last thing I heard him say was, "It's so beautiful." Then a drop of acid fell from the ceiling onto his shoulder. He didn't even scream, just made a soft, surprise sound as more drops fell, eating through his protective gear like it was paper. Sarah grabbed my arm. "Michael, we can't help him. We have to go." I pulled John his feet. He was still dazed from the sound, and we ran. Behind us, I could hear wet slithering noises and that mind-breaking screech. But worse than that, I could hear Mike's voice, calm and happy, saying, "I can see angels." We ran until we couldn't run anymore, taking random turns, not caring where we went as long as it was away from that room. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, we were in a narrow tunnel that seemed to go down forever. Sarah's hands were shaking so bad, she could barely hold her flashlight. John hadn't said a word since we left Mike behind. And me? I was trying hard not to think about how the tunnel walls seemed to be getting closer and closer. "We need to think," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why isn't it just killing us? It could have gotten us back there. But instead it's hurting us." Sarah finished, "Like cattle. Did you notice? Every time we try to go back up, passages disappear. It's forcing us to go deeper." John spoke for the first time since Mike died. "Just like the tourist group. It's pushing us all to the same place." That's when I heard something that made my blood freeze. From somewhere in the darkness below came a sound I hadn't heard in 15 years. My brother Tommy's voice. "Mike, help me. I'm stuck." "No," I whispered. "That's not real. Tommy's dead." But his voice came again, scared and young just like the day he died. "The rocks are falling. Mike, please." My legs started moving before I could stop myself. Some part of me knew it was a trick, but it didn't matter. That was my little brother's voice, and he needed me. Michael, wait! Sarah grabbed my arm. It's doing to you what it did to John earlier. It's not real. I knew she was right. But then Tommy screamed. That same scream I'd heard in my nightmares for 15 years. The tunnel was getting narrower, and I could feel the weight of the mountain above us. My chest was getting tight. Asterisk can't breathe. Walls too close. Tommy's screaming and I can't reach him. Asterisk, both of you. Look at me. Sarah said firmly. She shined her light on the walls. See these marks? They're fresh. The creature's been tunneling, making the passages smaller on purpose. It wants us to panic. She was right. Once I looked carefully, I could see where something had scraped away the rock, making the tunnel narrower than it should be. The creature was playing with our fears, John's guilt about his family, my claustrophobia and grief about Tommy. That's when I remembered something about my special gear. I always carried extra explosives for cave-ins, but I'd modified them over the years, made them stronger, strong enough to bring down a whole section of cave if we had to. Sarah, I said slowly, what happens to a predator if you destroy its hunting ground? She caught on quick. It either leaves or starves. But Michael, if we use explosives down here, we might not make it out. I finished, but neither will that thing, and no one else will ever come down here to be its food. Just then, we heard that awful screeching again. Closer this time. Our lights caught movement in the tunnel ahead. Something pale and huge squeezing its way through the rock like it was water. John screamed. The sound hit him harder this time, and blood started running from his nose. He turned and ran back the way we'd come. But that way was gone now. Just solid rock where the tunnel had been. Here, Sarah pointed to a tiny side passage. It's too small for that thing to follow. The passage was barely big enough for a person to squeeze through. My claustrophobia hit me like a punch in the gut. Asterisk can't do it. Too small. Gonna get stuck just like Tommy. Asterisk, but Sarah was right. It was our only chance. As John's screams echoed behind us, we started crawling into the narrowest tunnel I'd ever seen, dragging my bag of explosives behind us. The tunnel was so tight, I had to turn my head sideways just to move forward. Every few seconds, I had to stop and remind myself to breathe. Asterisk, don't think about the weight of the mountain. Don't think about being crushed. Don't think about Tommy. Asterisk, Sarah's voice came from ahead of me. There's a bigger cave room up here. Just 10 more feet. That's when we heard the rock around us start to crack. The creature wasn't trying to follow us through the tunnel. It was moving through the solid rock beside us, making the whole passage shake. Hurry, Sarah called. I pushed forward as fast as I could, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Just as the tunnel walls started to crumble, we fell into a large cave room. It was circular, with that same acid dripping from the ceiling. And there, scattered around the room, were the remains of the tourist group's equipment. This is it. Sarah said, this is where it brings them. The screeching filled the air again, but this time it was different, angry. Like it was mad we'd found its secret place. The walls rippled like water, and that pale thing with too many limbs started pushing through into the room. I grabbed my explosives and started setting them up as fast as I could. My hands were shaking, but I'd done this so many times I could have done it in my sleep. Sarah, help me place these around the support columns, if we bring down the right rocks. I turned around. Sarah was standing very still, staring up at the creature with a strange smile on her face. It's showing me such beautiful things. She whispered, I can see all the way down to the center of the earth. Sarah, no. I grabbed her arm, but she pulled away. Don't you want to see? She took a step toward the creature. It can show you Tommy, The real Tommy. Not just a voice. The creature reached for her with three of its limbs. I turned away, but I could still hear. I'll never forget those sounds. My chest was so tight I could barely breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in, but I forced myself to focus on the explosives. Asterisk one last job. Just like any other cave rescue. Set the charges. Start the timer. Asterisk the creature turned its attention to me. In my head, I could hear Tommy's voice. My mom's voice. Even my own voice saying I should just give up. Just let go. Join the others. Instead, I hit the detonator. The first explosion started a chain reaction. Rocks started falling everywhere as the cave ceiling came down. The creature made a sound like nothing I've ever heard before, rage and pain mixed together. One of its limbs caught me as I ran, burning through my leg with its acid touch. I crawled through the falling rocks, trying to find a way out. Water was pouring in from somewhere up above. The last thing I saw was the creature being crushed under a huge boulder. But even as I watched, it started to melt into the rock, disappearing. I don't remember how I got out. The rescue team found me 3 days later in a passage near the surface, babbling about acid and angels and things that live in the rock. My leg was badly burned, and most of my hair had turned white. They never found Sarah or John, or any of the original tourist group. The cave entrance collapsed in the explosion, and the whole section flooded with groundwater. They say it's impossible to get down there now, which is probably for the best. Nobody believed my story. Of course, how could they? I spent 6 months in a psychiatric hospital, and even now, people look at me funny when I talk about it. Some days, I'm not sure I believe it myself, but I know what I saw, and sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that screeching sound in my dreams, and I wonder, did I really kill it, or did it just go deeper, down into those hollow places where nothing should ever go? The doctors say I'll never work in caves again. That's fine by me. These days, I stick to wide open spaces where I can see the sky. But every time it rains, I think about those deep, dark hollows under the ground, and I pray that whatever's down there stays down there. Because the worst part, the part that really keeps me up at night, that thing in the cave, it's still growing, still tunneling, still making its hollow places. And sometimes, when I put my ear to the ground, I can hear it calling. My name is Margaret Henderson, but everyone calls me Maggie. I've been a park ranger at Olympic National Park in Washington for 23 years now. And what I'm about to tell you happened to me in the fall of 1983. I still get chills thinking about it. But people need to know what's out there in the mist. I was 48 then, recently divorced, and honestly, I preferred being alone in the woods to being around people. The ancient trees were my real family, the tall Douglas firs, the wise old cedars, and the thick moss that covered everything like a soft green blanket. I knew every trail, every hidden deer path, and every bush in my part of the park. That's why I was usually the one they called when other rangers went missing. It all started with the fog. Now, we get fog all the time in Olympic National Park. It's just part of life here. But this was different. This fog had been hanging around for weeks, thick and white like milk, and it never seemed to clear up. Not even in the afternoon sun. It just sat there, wrapping around the trees like ghostly fingers. I remember that morning clearly. I was standing at my cabin window, drinking my black coffee, when my radio crackled to life. It was Mark from Station 6, telling me another ranger had gone missing, the third one this week. That's when I knew something was very wrong. In all my years here, We'd never lost more than one ranger in a whole season. I put on my ranger uniform, grabbed my gear, and headed out to look for Jason, the missing ranger. The fog was so thick I could barely see 20 feet ahead of me. The forest was quiet too quiet. Usually, you'd hear birds singing, squirrels chattering, or leaves rustling in the wind. But that morning, everything was silent, like the whole forest was holding its breath. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. On one of the biggest cedar trees, way up high, higher than any bear could reach, there were these huge claw marks. They were fresh too. The pail was underneath still damp. Whatever made those marks had to be at least 8 feet tall when standing up. I heard a twig snap behind me, and when I turned around, I saw, well, that's when everything really began to change. But let me tell you, in all my years in these woods, nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. I know this might sound crazy, but every word I'm telling you is true. And trust me, the strange howls I started hearing that day, they were just the beginning of my nightmare in the mist. I made my way to Jason's ranger station, my boots barely making a sound on the damp ground. Something felt wrong, really wrong. You know that feeling you get when you think someone's watching you? It was like that. But worse, every few steps, I'd stop and listen. But all I could hear was my own breathing and the soft drip of moisture from the trees. When I reached Jason's station, my heart nearly stopped. The door was wide open, swinging back and forth in the light breeze. Inside, I found his ranger uniform torn to pieces on the floor. Not just ripped, it was like something had carefully cut it into strips. There was no blood, no sign of a fight, just those perfectly shredded pieces of cloth. I keyed my radio to call for help, but all I got was static. Then, through the white noise, I heard it, a howl that made every hair on my body stand up. It started low, almost too low to hear, but I could feel it in my chest. Then it got higher and higher until my head started spinning. I couldn't move. It was like my whole body was frozen in place. When I could finally move again, my legs were shaking so bad I had to sit down. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The fog was moving wrong. You see, fog usually drifts with the wind, but this fog, it was moving in circles, like it was following a pattern, or worse, like something in it was moving on purpose. I hurried back to my cabin and spent the whole night looking at my maps, marking where each ranger had disappeared. As I connected the dots, I realized these weren't random attacks. Whatever was out there was smart. It was moving in a pattern, taking out rangers one by one, working its way inward from the outer stations. That night, I barely slept. The howls kept coming, closer now, and sometimes I thought I could hear something moving around my cabin. Not like a bear or a wolf. This sounded like footsteps, but too heavy, too deliberate. And every time I looked out my window, the fog seemed to press against the glass, like it was trying to find a way in. I knew I had to do something. 3 rangers were missing, and whatever took them was still out there. But as I sat there in my cabin, listening to those strange howls echo through the trees, I realized I might be in way over my head. This wasn't like tracking a lost hiker or dealing with an angry bear. This was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist in our world. And tomorrow, I would have to go back out there and face it. The next morning, I grabbed my rifle, flashlight, and extra radio batteries. I know it sounds crazy, but I had to try to find the other rangers. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see my own feet as I walked. The tree branches above me were just dark shapes in the white mist. That's when I heard it, the sound of something big moving through the trees ahead. not crashing through like a bear would, but moving carefully, almost silently. I raised my rifle and called out, "This is Ranger Henderson. Identify yourself." No answer, just more careful footsteps, circling around me. Then I saw it, and my hand started shaking so bad I almost dropped my rifle. Through the fog, about 20 feet away, stood something that looked like a wolf, except it was standing up on two legs, and it was taller than any person I'd ever seen. Its fur was a weird gray color that seemed to blend with the mist. And its eyes were glowing like yellow streetlights. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was beating so fast I thought it might burst. The creature tilted its head, looking at me like it was thinking, really thinking, like a person would. Then it let out one of those horrible howls. And two more shapes appeared in the fog behind it. They were hunting as a pack, but not like normal wolves. They moved like they were all sharing one brain, spreading out to surround me. I'd seen wolf packs hunt before, but this was different. This was planned, organized. I fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed through the trees, but the creatures didn't run away like animals should. Instead, they stopped moving and all turned to look at me at the exact same time. It was the creepiest thing I'd ever seen. Then my radio crackled to life. Through the static, I heard screaming from one of the other ranger stations. The creatures' heads all snapped toward the sound, and they disappeared into the fog so fast I almost thought I'd imagined them. Almost. I ran back to my cabin as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so bad it took me 3 tries to get my key in the lock. Inside, I grabbed my emergency flares and my satellite phone. The regular radio channels were useless now. All they picked up was that awful howling. But as I was dialing for help, I looked out my window and my blood turned to ice. Standing at the edge of the trees was a whole line of those creatures. At least 6 of them. They were just watching my cabin, standing perfectly still in the fog. And somehow, I knew they were waiting for dark. Night fell faster than usual because of the fog. I had pushed my heavy wooden bookshelf in front of the door and closed all the shutters. The only light came from my emergency lantern, which cast scary shadows on the walls. Every few minutes, I heard those heavy footsteps circling my cabin. My satellite phone finally connected, and I tried to explain what was happening to my boss back at headquarters. "Frank, they're not normal wolves," I said, keeping my voice low. "They're walking on 2 legs. They're organized, and they're hunting us. Maggie, that's impossible," he said. But right then, one of those creatures slammed against my cabin wall, so hard the whole building shook. Frank heard it through the phone. "What was that?" "Send help." I whispered, "Send everyone you can." Then the power went out, and my phone died too, in the darkness. I heard more screams through my radio, this time from Station 4, where my friend Sarah worked. The creatures' howling started again, but this time it was different. It was like they were singing together, their voices making a sound that made my head spin and my legs feel weak. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there while they attacked other rangers. The fire lookout tower was about half a mile away, up on the hill. It was made of steel, not wood like my cabin, and it had emergency supplies. If I could get there, maybe I could signal for help. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with flares and water, and picked up my rifle. The creatures were still walking around my cabin, but I noticed something important. They stayed away from the light when I shined my flashlight through the windows. Taking a deep breath, I counted to 3 and threw open my back door. I ran as fast as I could through the fog, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Behind me, I heard them coming, not running, but walking fast on their two legs. They were so sure they would catch me that they didn't even need to hurry. The beam of my flashlight caught glimpses of them through the trees. They were everywhere, moving like shadows in the mist. But I kept running, my lungs burning and my legs aching. The lookout tower was close now. I could see its dark shape rising above the trees. Just as I reached the tower's base, I heard a sound that made my heart stop. Sarah's voice, crackling through my radio one last time. "Maggie, they're here. They're breaking in." Then there was only static. I climbed the tower steps as fast as I could, listening to the sound of those huge creatures starting to follow me up. As I slammed the tower door behind me and locked it, I realized something terrible. I wasn't just hiding anymore. I was making my last stand. The fire tower wasn't very big, just one room at the top with windows on all sides. As I looked out, I could see them climbing up the stairs, their glowing yellow eyes getting closer and closer. Their breathing sounded like a mix between a wolf's pant and a human's laugh. I had to think fast. Looking around the small room, I saw the emergency supplies, some old blankets, matches, lanterns, and, thank goodness, a box of road flares. That's when I remembered how they backed away from my flashlight. These creatures didn't like light. The first one reached the top of the stairs and started pushing against the door. The metal creaked like it was made of paper. I quickly lit a flare and held it up. The red light filled the tower, and I heard them growl and step back. But they were smart, too smart. They started taking turns ramming the door, and I knew it wouldn't hold much longer. I could hear more of them circling the tower below, their howls getting louder and louder until my head felt like it was full of cotton. The door burst open. Everything happened so fast after that. The biggest creature I'd ever seen stepped into the room. It had to bend down to fit through the door. In the flare's light, I could see its fur wasn't really gray. It shifted colors like the fog itself. I threw the flare right at it. The creature jumped back, but not before its fur caught fire. The smell of burning hair filled the air, and it let out a howl that was almost human. That gave me an idea, a crazy, dangerous idea. I grabbed a box of road flares and started lighting them all, one by one, throwing them around the room. Soon the whole tower was full of bright red light and smoke. The creatures backed away from the windows, snarling and covering their eyes. But I wasn't done. I took one of the old blankets and lit it on fire too. Then another, and another. Soon the whole tower was starting to burn. The creatures were panicking now. They didn't like the fire at all. They started running back down the stairs, pushing and shoving each other to get away. But I was trapped up here with the flames getting bigger. That's when I remembered something. There was a river right below the tower, about 30 feet down, through the smoke and flames. I could see the water reflecting the fire's light. I had a choice, burn or jump. I jumped. The cold water hit me like 1,000 needles, but I forced myself to swim underwater as far as I could. When I finally came up for air, I was a good distance downstream. The tower behind me was completely on fire now, lighting up the whole forest. In its light, I could see the creatures retreating into the fog, their howls fading away. I made it back to the ranger station hours later. By morning, when help finally arrived, the fog had cleared for the first time in weeks. They found no trace of the creatures, no footprints, no claw marks, nothing. 4 rangers had died that night, including my friend Sarah. Some people say I imagine it all, that maybe the fog and fear played tricks on my mind. But I know what I saw, and even now, years later, whenever the fog rolls in thick and heavy over Olympic National Park, I hear those howls in the distance, and I know they're still out there, walking in the mist, waiting for their chance to return. My name is James McCullough, and this happened to me in the winter of 1957. I was 42 then, working as a park ranger in the White Mountain National Forest of New Hampshire. Before that, I was a medic in the Korean War. Sometimes I still wake up thinking I'm back there, hearing the sounds of wounded men calling for help. But this story isn't about Korea. It's about something worse, something that made those war memories feel like pleasant dreams. I remember everything about that winter. It was the coldest one I'd seen in my 15 years as a ranger. The snow came down so heavy that some parts of the forest got cut off completely. The ancient pines, some older than America itself, creaked and groaned under the weight of all that snow. The old-timers in town said it wasn't natural. The Native Americans who lived nearby were even more worried. They said something about a blood moon awakening ancient spirits. But I didn't pay much attention then. I should have. It all started on February 12th. The weather station had warned about a surprise snowstorm coming in. But 3 hikers had already gone up the mountain the day before. They were supposed to check in at the ranger station by noon. They never did. Just another rescue mission. I thought as I grabbed my gear. I'd done this dozens of times before. Find lost hikers. Get them somewhere warm. Listen to their embarrassed thank yous. I packed my old military compass, some flares, my radio, and enough supplies for 3 days. The weight of the pack felt comfortable on my shoulders. Like an old friend, little did I know, this wouldn't be like any rescue I'd done before. As I stepped out into that white wilderness, I had no idea I was being watched. No idea that something hungry was waiting in those ancient pines. Something that had been waiting for centuries. And so began the worst 4 days of my life. Worse than anything I saw in Korea. This is my story. And I swear every word of it is true. Though sometimes, late at night, I wish it wasn't. The snow was already knee-deep when I started up the trail. The hikers, 2 men and a woman in their 20s, had told the station they planned to camp near Mirror Lake. It should have been an easy 2-hour hike to reach their campsite, but nothing was easy in this weather. My boots crunched through the fresh snow as I checked my compass. The wind was picking up, making the pine branches sway above me like giant hands. I'd walked these trails 1,000 times, but something felt different today. The forest was too quiet. Usually, you'd hear birds, squirrels, something, but there was nothing except the sound of my own breathing and the wind. After an hour of hiking, I found their first trail marker, a piece of orange ribbon tied to a tree branch. Good. They'd followed the safety instructions we give all hikers. I clicked my radio to update the station. Base. This is McCullough. Found first marker at Point Charlie. Moving forward. Only static answered back. I tried again, but nothing. That's weird. I thought. The radio had never failed me this close to the station before. The temperature was dropping fast. I could feel it in my bones. The kind of cold that reminds you how alone you are out here. The sun was still up, but the thick clouds made it look like evening was coming early. I picked up my pace. Then I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. About 50 yards ahead, there was a backpack hanging from a tree branch. Not placed there, but hanging like someone had thrown it up high. Really high, maybe 15 feet up. No human could have tossed it that far up. Maybe a bear. I told myself, but deep down, I knew better. Bears were hibernating this time of year, and bears don't hang backpacks in trees. As I stood there looking up at that backpack, I heard it, a voice calling from somewhere in the woods. Help. Is anyone there? It sounded like a young woman, probably one of the missing hikers. But something wasn't right about it. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And it was too clear, too perfect, like someone reading from a script. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. In Korea, I'd learned to trust that feeling. It had saved my life more than once. Hello, I called back, unclipping the rifle from my pack. This is Ranger McCullough. I'm here to help. The voice called again. But this time it came from the opposite direction. Help. Is anyone there? Exactly the same words. Exactly the same tone. Like a recording being played back. The quiet forest suddenly felt like a trap. And I had walked right into it. I needed to get that backpack down, using my rifle strap as a hook. It took me 3 tries to snag it. When I finally got it down, my hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from what I found inside. There was a camera, some granola bars, and a journal. The last entry was from yesterday. Day 2, something's following us. Mark says it's just wolves. But wolves don't walk on 2 legs. We keep hearing voices at night. They sound like people we know, calling us to come outside. Jenny swears she heard her mom last night, but her mom passed away last year. We're breaking camp at sunrise. This was a mistake. Keep it together. James, I told myself, focus on the mission. The sun was getting lower, and I still hadn't found their camp. Then I caught a scent that made my stomach turn. The metallic smell of blood mixed with pine. I followed it to a small clearing, and that's where I found their tent, or what was left of it. The tent was torn to shreds, like something had ripped through it from the outside. Sleeping bags were scattered everywhere. Their supplies were spread out in the snow, and I saw long scratch marks in the frozen ground. But the worst part was the footprints. They were human-shaped, but wrong, too long, too deep in the snow, and they seemed to change as they went along, starting normal size near the tent, then getting longer and longer, like whatever made them was growing. I knelt down to take a closer look. That's when I heard the whisper, right behind my ear, "Help me. Document." I spun around, my heart pounding. Nobody was there, but I knew that voice. It belonged to Tommy Chun, a young soldier who died in my arms in Korea. There was no way I could be hearing his voice here, in these woods. 5 years later, the wind picked up suddenly, and snow started swirling around me through the white haze. I saw something moving between the trees, something tall and thin, like a pine tree walking. But when I blinked, it was gone. The radio at my hip crackled to life through bursts of static. I heard voices, the missing hikers, calling for help, but their voices were mixed with others I knew, soldiers I'd lost in the war, old friends who'd passed away, all of them begging for help. This isn't real. I told myself, this can't be real. But the tracks in the snow were real. The torn tent was real. And deep down, I knew the stories the locals told about these woods, about the Wendigo and its hunger. Those were real too. Night was coming. I had to make a choice. Head back to safety, or follow those impossible footprints into the darkening forest. But I knew it wasn't really a choice at all. Those hikers needed help, and that's what I was here for. I checked my rifle, tightened my pack, and started following the tracks. The wind howled through the trees, and somewhere in that sound, I could hear laughter. The tracks led me deeper into the forest than I'd ever gone before. The trees here were ancient, their trunks wider than cars, their branches tangled together overhead like a dark ceiling. My flashlight beam seemed to get swallowed up by the darkness. It was fully night now, but turning back wasn't an option. I kept thinking about that journal entry, about the voices calling them out of their tent. Had they followed those voices, like I was following these tracks? The snow was falling harder, but the track stayed clear, like something was keeping them fresh. They led to the base of a cliff I'd never seen before. There, hidden behind a curtain of ice, I found the entrance to a cave. Don't go in there. Everything inside me screamed. But then I saw the fresh boot prints in the snow normal. Human boot prints, leading inside. The hikers had gone in here, maybe looking for shelter. I had to follow. I clicked on my headlamp and ducked inside. The cave was like a frozen tunnel, with walls of solid ice. My breath made little clouds in front of my face. As I moved deeper, I started to see things frozen in the ice walls, old backpacks, camping gear, and things that looked much older. A rusty rifle that could have been from World War II, an old leather bag that might have been there for 100 years. Then I found something that made my blood run cold. There were shapes in the ice, human shapes. I stepped closer, shining my light on them. They were people, frozen in moments of terror, their faces twisted in fear. Some looked fresh. Others had been there so long, they were barely more than shadows in the ice. I backed away, my heart pounding. That's when my headlamp caught something moving at the edge of its beam, something that shouldn't have been able to move that fast. James, a voice called from the darkness. It was Jenny, one of the missing hikers. Why didn't you come sooner? Jenny? I called out. Stay where you are. I'm coming to help. Her laugh echoed through the cave, but it changed halfway through, becoming something else, something that sounded like breaking ice and creaking wood. My radio burst to life again, but this time I heard my own voice coming through it. Stay where you are. I'm coming to help. The thing in the cave was learning, copying, playing with its food. I'd walked right into its lair, just like all the others frozen in these walls. I heard movement behind me, fast, scraping across the ice. I spun around and finally saw it, clearly in my flashlight beam. The sight of it turned my insides to ice. It was tall, so tall it had to bend under the cave ceiling. Its skin was like dead wood, stretched over a skeleton that was all wrong. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in long fingers with claws like icicles. But its face, I'll never forget its face. It looked like it was wearing a deer's skull, but the skull was cracked and broken, showing rows of teeth that went all the way down its throat. And in its eyes, I saw all the people it had taken, all the souls it had trapped in its endless hunger. I raised my rifle, but in the split second it took me to aim, it was gone. The only sound was my own panic breathing and the soft drip of melting ice. I wasn't the hunter here. I never had been. My hands were shaking as I pulled my backup flashlight from my pack. In the war, we had a saying, when you're surrounded, make your own exit. I still had the emergency flares, some rope, and most importantly, the blasting charges we rangers use for clearing fallen trees. The creature was toying with me now. I could hear it moving around in the darkness, its claws scraping against ice, getting closer and then backing away. It wasn't just hunting me, it was enjoying my fear. That's when I remembered something important. Every predator, no matter how strong, has a weakness. This thing lived in a cave of ice, ice that could melt. You want me? I shouted into the darkness. Come and get me. I started setting up the charges around the cave entrance, working as fast as I could. My fingers were numb from the cold, but I couldn't stop. The creature's movements got faster, more excited. It thought I was getting desperate, making mistakes, just like in Korea. I thought, make them think they've won. I heard Jenny's voice again, closer this time. Please help us. James, we're so cold. Then Tommy's voice, don't leave us here. Document, Then my own voice. Laughing, I finished setting the last charge and backed toward the cave entrance. The creature's shadow loomed on the ice wall. Getting bigger, it was done playing. It came at me fast, faster than anything that big should be able to move. In the flashlight's beam, I saw its mouth open wide, showing those endless rows of teeth. The smell of old blood and pine needles filled the air. I waited until the last possible second. Then threw my flashlight deep into the cave. The creature's head snapped toward the movement, just like I hoped it would. That's when I pulled the detonator trigger. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space. The charges didn't just blow up. They kicked up a wave of heat that made the ice walls crack. The creature screamed, and it wasn't copying any human voice now. This was its real voice, the sound of winter itself dying. I ran. Behind me, I heard the cave collapsing, ice breaking, and that terrible scream getting weaker. Something sharp caught my left hand as I escaped. But I didn't stop running until I was far from the cave entrance. When I finally looked back, the whole cliff face had collapsed. Steam rose from the rubble like the earth was breathing. My left hand was bleeding badly. The creature's claw had sliced right through my glove. Later, the doctors would have to take most of that hand due to frostbite and infection. I found the 3 hikers' bodies in the spring. When the worst of the ice melted, they were huddled together near the back of what was left of the cave. I made sure they got back to their families. I told the official investigators that they got lost in the storm and froze to death. Who would believe the truth? I retired from the Ranger service that year. But I didn't leave the area. Someone needs to stay here, to remember, to warn others, because even though I buried that thing under tons of rock and ice, I know these mountains. Ice melts, rocks shift, things buried deep can find their way back to the surface. Sometimes, on cold winter nights when the moon is full, I hear voices calling from the forest. They sound like those hikers, like Tommy from the war, and now like my own voice too. But I don't answer anymore. I just add another log to the fire, hold my damaged hand close, and wait for morning, because I know it's out there, waiting in the ancient pines, and I know that it remembers me too. My name is Robert Williams, but everyone calls me Bob. This happened to me back in 1976, when I was working as a park ranger in the Ozark National Forest in Arkansas. I was 35 then, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about these woods. Boy, was I wrong. I come from Native American roots, the last of my bloodline. Actually, my grandfather raised me here, teaching me about the spirits of the land and the old ways. He gave me this special amulet before he died, saying it would protect me when the time came. I didn't understand what he meant back then. Now I wish I had asked more questions. That summer was the worst drought anyone could remember. The rivers dried up to trickles, and the earth cracked like broken pottery. The heat was so bad it felt like the air itself was burning. But the worst part, the drought revealed things that should have stayed buried. I remember the day it all started. I was sitting in my ranger station, fanning myself with yesterday's newspaper, when I got a call about some archaeologists who'd set up a dig site near the old cave systems. Usually, those caves were underwater, but the drought had exposed them. The university folks were excited about it, said they'd found something big. I didn't like it, not one bit. My grandfather used to tell me stories about those caves, stories that would make my skin crawl even on the hottest day. But who was going to listen to old tribal tales when there was science to be done? The forest was acting strange too. Animals were showing up in all the wrong places, moving in ways that didn't make sense. We had reports of cattle being killed, really nasty stuff. Everyone blamed it on cougars, but I'd tracked cougars my whole life. And this was different. The kills were wrong. The tracks were wrong. Everything was wrong. I wore my grandfather's amulet every day. A simple thing made of leather and bone. Sometimes, when I was alone in the woods, I could swear it grew warm against my chest, like it was trying to tell me something. If only I had learned to listen sooner. What I'm about to tell you, well, some folks might say I'm crazy. Maybe I am, but I know what I saw in those caves. I know what happened to those archaeologists. And I know why I haven't spoken a word since that night under the full moon. This is my story, and I need to write it down before I forget the details. Before time makes me question whether it was all real, because it was real, too real, and sometimes late at night, when the wind howls through the trees just right, I can still hear them calling. The trouble really began 3 days after I got that call about the archaeologists. They were supposed to check in every evening, standard protocol for anyone doing research in the forest. But that night, no call came. I tried their camp phone twice, but only got static, probably just bad reception. I told myself, but my stomach felt tight. The amulet around my neck was warm, really warm, like a hot cup of coffee against my chest. I decided to drive out there first thing in the morning. The sun was barely up when I parked my Ranger truck at the end of the dirt road. From there, it was a 15-minute hike to their camp. The whole way, something fell off. The birds weren't singing. Even the insects were quiet. In all my years in these woods, I'd never heard such silence. When I reached the camp, I stopped dead in my tracks. The tents were shredded, like something had torn through them from the inside out. Papers and equipment were scattered everywhere. Coffee cups still sat on a folding table, half full and covered in ants. But there was no blood, no signs of a struggle. It was like everyone had just vanished. I pulled out my radio to call for backup, but all I got was that same static from last night. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were everywhere, all mixed up in the dirt, some human, some animal. But the animal prints, they weren't right. They started as deer tracks, then changed a bear halfway through, then human, then something I couldn't even recognize. My grandfather's voice echoed in my head. The skinwalkers leave no tracks that make sense to man, for they are neither man nor beast. I found their dig site about 50 yards from the camp. They'd uncovered the entrance to one of the old caves, and I could see their equipment still set up inside, on the cave wall. Someone had written "don't" in red spray paint. Below it were much older markings, carvings in the rock that made my blood run cold. I recognized them from my grandfather's teachings, symbols meant to warn about ancient evils. The air coming from that cave mouth was wrong. It was hot outside, must have been 90 degrees already, but the breeze from the cave was ice cold, and it carried a smell not like normal cave air, but something else, something that reminded me of spoiled meat and wet fur. I heard a twig snap behind me and spun around. At the edge of the clearing stood a deer, just a regular white-tailed deer, watching me, but something about the way it stood made my skin crawl. Its head was too still, and its eyes looked human when it saw me looking. It smiled. I swear on my life. That deer pulled back its lips and smiled at me with teeth that no deer should have. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The deer kept watching me, its head turning too far, much farther than a normal deer's neck should bend. Then it made a sound, not a deer's snort or call, but something like human laughter. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. 20 years in these woods, and I ran like a scared kid. Back at my truck, I sat with shaking hands on the steering wheel, trying to remember everything my grandfather had told me about the skinwalkers. They walk in threes. His voice echoed in my memory. They take the shapes of what they eat, but they can never quite get it right. And they're patient. Bob. They'll wait and watch and learn until they know just how to hurt you most. The amulet was burning against my skin now. I pulled it out and saw that the bone piece had turned black, like it had been held over a fire. That's when I remembered the rest of Grandfather's warning. If the bone turns black, they're hunting. If it burns through its cord, they've chosen their prey. I had to think. The archaeologists had found something in that cave, something that was sealed away long ago. My people had put those warning signs there for a reason, but now the seal was broken, and 3 ancient evil things were loose in my forest. As if to confirm my thoughts, a scream echoed through the trees. It started as an animal's cry, but changed halfway through into something horribly human. It came from the direction of Miller's farm, where I knew the 2 junior rangers, Mike and Sarah, were checking on reports of dead cattle. The sun was starting to set. In my grandfather's stories, moonrise was always when the skinwalkers were strongest. I looked at my watch. 2 hours until dark. 2 hours to find Mike and Sarah, to figure out how to stop these things, and to somehow complete the ritual my grandfather had taught me long ago, but I never thought I'd need. I grabbed my emergency pack from the truck, flashlight, first aid kit, flare gun, and the little bag of sacred herbs I'd always carried but never used. The amulet pulsed against my chest like a second heartbeat as I started walking toward Miller's farm. Behind me, I heard movement in the bushes, and that terrible human deer laugh again. They were following me, playing with me, and somewhere ahead, 2 young rangers had no idea what was coming. The walk to Miller's farm felt like the longest 15 minutes of my life. Every shadow looked wrong. Every rustle in the trees made me jump. Twice I saw what looked like people watching me from between the trees. But when I turned to look straight at them, they were gone. I found Mike's truck parked by the old barn, but no sign of him or Sarah. The cattle field ahead was empty except for what looked like a pile of bones picked completely clean. My grandfather's words came back to me. They leave no bodies. They consume everything. Mike, Sarah, I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The echo of my shout bounced back from the trees, but it didn't sound quite right. It sounded like someone or something was mocking me. Then I heard Sarah's voice from inside the barn. Bob, is that you? We need help in here. Something was wrong. The voice was Sarah's, but the words weren't quite right, like someone who had heard her speak but didn't know how to copy her exactly. My amulet was practically sizzling now. Hold on. Sarah, I yelled back, but I didn't move toward the barn. Instead, I pulled out my flashlight and shined it through one of the barn's broken windows. What I saw inside made my blood freeze. There was Sarah all right, or what looked like Sarah. She was standing too straight, her head tilted at an impossible angle, and behind her, hanging from the rafters, were 2 bundles wrapped in cobwebs. They were moving. Come help us. Bob. Not Sarah said, her face splitting into a grin that showed too many teeth. We've been waiting for you. I heard movement behind me and spun around. There was Mike, walking out of the trees, but his feet were backward, and his skin looked like it was trying to decide whether to be human or something else. The young one's blood was sweet. Not, Mike said in a voice that bubbled like thick mud, but yours will be sweeter. The blood of the old bloodlines always is. I did the only thing I could think of. I pulled out my flare gun and fired it through the barn window. The red light filled the building, and what I saw in that flash will haunt me forever. Sarah's shape was melting, changing into something that belonged in nightmares. The real Sarah and Mike were still alive in those cocoons, struggling weakly. The skinwalkers screamed, a sound like metal scratching on bone, and for a moment, Their true forms were visible in the flare's light. They were shadow and teeth and hunger all mixed together in shapes that hurt to look at. I ran for the barn door. I had to get Mike and Sarah down before, but I was too late. The third skinwalker appeared in the doorway. This one wore the shape of one of the missing archaeologists, but its eyes were empty and black. Behind me, the other two were closing in. You know where we need to take him. The third one said in a voice like dry leaves scraping on stone, "The cave, the ritual place. That's where his blood must flow." They grabbed me. Their hands felt wrong, sometimes like human fingers, sometimes like claws, sometimes like something I can't even describe. I fought, but it was like wrestling with shadows. The amulet around my neck burst into white-hot heat. Then I remembered another thing my grandfather had taught me. The amulet doesn't just protect, it guides. When the moment comes, let it show you the way. So I stopped fighting. Instead, I grabbed the amulet with both hands and whispered the prayer my grandfather had made me memorize as a child. The skinwalkers hissed as the amulet grew brighter, but they didn't let go. They started dragging me toward the cave. Behind us, I could hear Mike and Sarah's muffled screams from their cocoons. "I'll come back for you," I promised in my mind. "Just hold on." The journey to the cave was like a nightmare. The skinwalkers moved fast, shifting between shapes as they went, sometimes running on four legs, sometimes floating like mist, sometimes crawling like spiders. They kept their hold on me the whole time, their touch burning cold through my clothes. When we reached the cave entrance, I saw that the archaeologist's equipment was all smashed now, but their lights were still working, shining deep into the darkness. The warning symbols on the walls seemed to glow in the artificial light. The skinwalkers dragged me deeper and deeper into the cave. The air got colder with every step. Then we entered a large chamber I hadn't seen before. Ancient drawings covered the walls, pictures of my ancestors fighting these same creatures, trapping them here centuries ago. In the center of the chamber was a stone that looked like an altar. The skinwalkers forced me toward it, their forms becoming more solid, more horrifying. The one that looked like an archaeologist spoke again. "Your bloodline sealed us away," it said, "and your blood will set us free forever. Then we can hunt as we please, take any shape we want, feed on all the sweet life above." But as they pushed me toward the altar, I felt the amulet pulse one last time, and suddenly I knew exactly what I had to do. My grandfather hadn't given me the amulet to protect me. He'd given it to me to finish what our ancestors had started. As the skinwalkers forced me onto the cold stone altar, I gripped the amulet tight and started speaking the words my grandfather had taught me. Not the protection prayer from before, but another one older, deeper, words that felt like fire in my mouth. The skinwalkers realized what I was doing too late. The amulet began to glow brighter than ever, burning hot enough to smoke. The cave walls seemed to pulse with a deep red light as the ancient symbols came alive. "Stop him," the leader shrieked, its human disguise melting away to reveal its true form, a thing of shadows and teeth and endless hunger. But they couldn't touch me now. The amulet's light held them back. I kept speaking the words, even though each one felt like swallowing broken glass. The amulet grew hotter and hotter in my hands. I could smell my own skin burning, but I didn't let go. I couldn't let go. The skinwalkers began to howl, a sound that started like wolf cries and ended like human screams. They tried to run, but the cave entrance had sealed itself. The red light from the walls grew brighter, and I could feel the whole cave shaking. The amulet shattered in my hands, each piece burning like a star. As it broke, I felt something tear inside my throat, like the words had ripped something vital away. But I could see the magic working. The skinwalkers were being pulled toward the altar, their bodies stretching and twisting as the ancient spell took hold. I rolled off the altar just as the first rocks started falling from the ceiling, through the chaos and the red light and the horrible screaming. I ran. I ran for the cave entrance. For Mike and Sarah. For my life. Behind me, the skinwalker's screams got higher and higher until they suddenly stopped. The cave floor cracked, and a deep rumble shook the whole forest. I barely made it out before the entrance collapsed. I staggered back to the barn on shaking legs. The cocoons were dissolving. And Mike and Sarah fell from the rafters. They were alive but weak, barely conscious. I tried to speak, to tell them it was over, but no words came out. No words have come out since. The rescue team found us an hour later. The official report said it was an earthquake that collapsed the cave system. They said Mike and Sarah had been attacked by a bear, and I'd saved them. They said a lot of things to explain what happened, but I know the truth. Sometimes, at night, I touch the scars on my palms where the amulet burned me. I try to speak, but I can't. The price of the ritual. I guess the last words I ever spoke were in that ancient language, binding those evil things back into the earth. The cave is gone now, buried under tons of rock. The drought ended that same night, with a rain that lasted 3 days. The forest feels right again, normal, safe, but I still walk these trails, still watch, still remember, because my grandfather taught me that some things can never really die. They just sleep, and someone has to remember where they're buried and why.